In 1803, President Thomas Jefferson purchased over 500 million acres of land from the French. The Louisiana Purchase embodied a territory so massive that it now touches 15 states and makes up more than 1/5 of the modern United States. Incredibly, it was purchased for a total of $15 million. I know celebrities that purchase homes for more than $15 million. My name's Brian Reese. I'm joined by George Jarrett and John Haas. Today we're talking about the Louisiana Purchase. John, why do our students need to understand this idea of the Louisiana Purchase?
Well, I think this is one of the greatest purchases that ever took place. We doubled the size of the United States for $15 million, as you mentioned, which is roughly 3 cents an acre. Okay. And the great historian Henry Adams said, never did the United States grab so much for so little. And it was just an incredible bargain.
Yeah. All right, now, this is a massive land purchase. Just that in itself has huge consequences for the United States. What are those consequences? Why was it so important?
Well, I mean, on the most basic level, it gives you land to grow, right? I mean, for Jefferson, he wanted to see more farms. He didn't like big cities. He thought that the heart of democracy was in the farmer and his self-reliance, and you need more land for that. So that's one. And I think the other, just looking forward 60 years in American history, without that land to expand, you wouldn't have had the expansion of slavery. Without the expansion of slavery, you wouldn't have had a civil war. So certainly, it may have been good news for people who wanted to expand their farms, but it was bad news for the slaves, and the expansion of slavery became, the central issue of the 19th century and the one that led to the Civil War.
If I could jump in real quickly, George pointed out something very important. Jefferson was very afraid of the growth of cities. He was afraid of the concentration of wealth, and as he said, the cities are panders of vice. So the idea of doubling the size of the United States, and his vision for America was the yeoman farmer. Right. Now, I'm not sure if this yeoman farmer actually existed or was more mythological, but he was supposed to be self-sufficient, independent. He was going to be educated. This was the safety valve. It was the best way to preserve Republican liberty, and I think that's why Jefferson was so intent on doubling the size of the United States.
Do you think it changed the kind of balance of power to a certain extent in the United States with this addition of rural citizens now from the Louisiana Purchase and more urban citizens in the East?
Oh, absolutely. And it's one of the things the Federalists were very upset, and clearly the Federalists could not be upset about the price. Obviously, it was a steal, but the Federalists were upset that their real estate prices would go down. As you open up much land, people would migrate to the West, and their real estate, the prices for their homes would go down. Also, the fact that they were worried about things becoming de-civilized as these people would move out. They kind of prided themselves on the fact that they were half man, half alligator. And if we look at it, we have 3 presidents in a row from Virginia. You have Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, and James Monroe. And clearly, the people that got the land started to vote for the Democratic Republicans, which the Federalists were very, very concerned about, that they were losing that grip on power.
Now, this purchase moves the United States, at least the western border, all the way over to the Rockies in some parts. Now, I know the idea of the western frontier really kind of starts to come into the American consciousness later, but how does this influence it, or how does this relate to the idea of the western frontier at all?
Well, I mean, one way to see it is this is the beginning of the frontier process, or I think another way to see it is that it's a continuation of the process that led to the founding of the colonies to begin with. In other words, colonization continues westward because you have the same thing. You have people moving into territory where American Indians live, competing with them for land, sort of civilizing the land in their minds,
agriculturally, and
right,
cultivating the land. And
I think what John said about the concerns about people becoming savage in the wilderness are certainly continuing, and so you have an absence at first. When people move out, institutions like churches and government, they're weaker. They're not non-existent, and people are
those
quick
are more
to
kind of
establish
urban institutions, really.
Right. And so you do have that continual process of movement.
How were the Indians affected by this? I mean, this was
horribly.
Okay. Explain.
Well, again, it's a continuation of the process of colonization, so the same sort of epidemics that greeted European colonization on the coast are showing up as late as the late part of the 1800s in parts of the Louisiana Territory. You have, again, the Euro-Americans looking for land, and so they start wars, they win wars. I mean, ultimately, Native Americans are almost always overmatched when it comes to that kind of conflict. And so there's a very rapid...
Just taking Native American lands by force, essentially. So,
and there's a rapid shrinking of the land that's available for Native people to live on, both through the literal process of putting people on reservations and just the practical process. Well, other people came in and we can't hunt there anymore, we can't farm there anymore. So
one of the things I'd like to add about that is that when we purchased, the United States purchased Louisiana, we had no idea what we purchased. And we had to attend the Lewis and Clark expedition
there was some
out
discrepancy about what the actual lines were.
Absolutely. And Lewis and Clark finally got into what I would call the Oregon country, and the reason I call it Oregon as opposed to Oregon, we're talking about the present states of Oregon, Washington, and Canada, and Lewis and Clark put the old American flag into the ground to claim the Oregon country, and I always laugh about that idea that you can put a flag in something, you own it,
now it's yours,
like Americans did on the moon, but the British taught us that, and then Great Britain put the Union Jack, and so we kind of shared that concern for the Oregon country.
All right, now purchasing the Louisiana Territory was not a slam dunk. There were some people for it. Obviously, President Jefferson was for it. Some people against it. You alluded to the Federalists. Explain the pros and cons about purchasing this.
Well, I think one of the important parts was that the Federalists may have been against the idea that they were losing power. I don't think they were against the idea of doubling the size of the United States.
Real quick, who were the Federalists? Who were they?
The original Federalists were those people who advocated the Constitution in 1787. Of course, they went on to be a party in themselves with George Washington, John Adams, and Alexander Hamilton. But they might have been upset that they were losing some power, but the acquisition of the land was something very powerful. What I'd also like to add is that Jefferson had no constitutional right to take the Louisiana Purchase. And a lot of people will talk about Jefferson being a hypocrite, the paradox of that Jefferson was against the first bank of the United States because nowhere was it enumerated in the Constitution, and yet he doubled the size of the United States.
He was known as a strict constitutional follower, basically, until the Louisiana Purchase.
And I think that's why it's so important to understand what his social vision was for America. If the farmers have land, they will always have Republican liberty.
It's the great kind of equalizer.
Great equalizer, move away from the cities, move away from consolidation of power and wealth in the bank, the Hamiltonian system, and start to move out. And if you wanted to preserve Republican liberty, that was the way to do it with a yeoman farmer.
Now, didn't our international relations policy kind of fit into this? I mean, we needed to maintain a relationship with the French, the Spanish, the British. How did the Louisiana Purchase kind of affect that?
Well,
I mean, again, the other big split between the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans, besides this vision of the development of the country, whether it should be city or country, was whether to take the side. And I always use the analogy of the Cold War. It's as if the whole world, you either have to be on England's side or France's side. Federalists were on England's side. England obviously was threatened by this huge territorial expansion of the United States. Jefferson was on France's side for the most part, and so this was seen by the Federalists and by people in the world, as taking advantage of that relationship.
Yeah. If I could add, when Spain ceded this territory in the secret treaty, Jefferson was very alarmed that we would lose control of the Mississippi River. And for very poor farmers, as long as they could get their produce down to the Mississippi River, they'd get that free ride down to New Orleans and they could take it to European markets. And in the beginning, what we wanted was only West Florida. That's why we sent our representative out there, and we had the chance to double the size of the United States. Really shocked us for 15 years.
Now, wasn't that kind of a surprise to Jefferson when the French offered the entire territory? We're just trying to purchase basically the Louisiana area, what's today is Louisiana. And, how did that transpire? Why did they offer the whole entire territory?
Well, Napoleon was very hard up. We had the beginning of the Napoleonic Wars. They had a ceasefire between the British and the French when it started up. And I think we were at the right place at the right time. Napoleon was very wishy-washy. Jefferson knew that. You couldn't hesitate. Many people had argued that we needed to have an amendment, that 3/4 of the states would have to have an amendment so that Jefferson could do this. And Jefferson was smart enough, and I'm glad that he did that. He realized that he had to get in there very, very quickly. But we profited, at least in the beginning, from the fact that Napoleon and the French were hard up for cash to fight the British in the Napoleonic Wars.
Well, and I would have to add that Napoleon had sent a small force to secure Louisiana, but they were supposed to stop off in Haiti and put down the revolution there first. And they never succeeded in that. So, I mean, in some small way, we can thank rebellious slaves in the Caribbean for the United States getting
half of that.
Because if he'd been successful in holding on to Haiti and the Louisiana Territory militarily, he wouldn't have had any reason to sell it to the United States. I mean, at that point, maybe some later point, certainly Napoleon's record was kind of uneven from then on. But
all right, we're running out of time. How would you summarize to your students in 1 or 2 sentences the significance of the Louisiana Purchase?
Well, growth and everything that comes with it. So conflict over slavery, conflict with American Indians, and ultimately, I think, the idea of manifest destiny, that the United States should take over the whole continent. And they got at least the middle third of it.
Yes, that's right.
I would say we doubled the size of the United States for nothing.
All right, when the purchase of the Louisiana Territory, America doubled its land mass and extended her western boundary to the Rocky Mountains. The race to the Pacific Ocean was on. We'll see you next time at My History Lab.